Three Slow Glass Stories by Bob Shaw. The first story, Light of Other Days, was originally published in the August 1966 issue of Analog magazine. The second, Burden of Proof, was originally published in the May 1967 issue of Analog, and the third, A Dome of Many-Colored Glass, first appeared in the April 1972 issue of Fantastic magazine. Each were republished many times in multiple anthologies throughout the years. The author expanded these and their unifying concept of slow glass into a novel entitled Other Days, Other Eyes, which was first serialized in Amazing magazine in May and July 1972 and novelized in the same year. The latter will be read and linked to this video in future. Read by Daryl T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Light of Other Days. Leaving the village behind, we followed the heady sweeps of the road up into a land of slow glass. I had never seen one of the farms before, and at first found them slightly eerie, an effect heightened by imagination and circumstance. The car's turbine was pulling smoothly and quietly in the damp air, so that we seemed to be carried over the convolutions of the road in a kind of supernatural silence. On our right, the mountain sifted down into an incredibly perfect valley of timeless pine, and everywhere stood the great frames of slow glass, drinking light. An occasional flash of afternoon sunlight on their wind-bracing created an illusion of movement, but in fact the frames were deserted. The rows of windows had been standing on the hillside for years, staring into the valley, and men only cleaned them in the middle of the night when their human presence would not matter to the thirsty glass. They were fascinating, but Selina and I didn't mention the windows. I think we hated each other so much we both were reluctant to sully anything new by drawing it into the nexus of our emotions. The holiday, I had begun to realize, was a stupid idea in the first place. I had thought it would cure everything, but of course it didn't stop Selina being pregnant, and worse still, it didn't even stop her being angry about being pregnant. Rationalizing our dismay over her condition, we had circulated the usual statements to the effect that we would have liked having children, but later on at the proper time. Selina's pregnancy had cost us her well-paid job, and with it the new house we'd been negotiating, and which was far beyond the reach of my income from poetry. But the real source of our annoyance was that we were face to face with the realization that people who say they want children later always mean they want children never. Our nerves were thrumming with the knowledge that we, who had thought ourselves so unique, had fallen into the same biological trap as every mindless, rutting creature which ever existed. The road took us along the southern slopes of the Ben Cruachan until we began to catch glimpses of the gray Atlantic far ahead. I had just cut our speed to absorb the view better when I noticed the sign spiked to a gatepost. It said, "Slow Glass, Quality High, Prices Low, J.R. Hagen." On an impulse, I stopped the car on the verge, wincing slightly as tough grasses whipped noisily at the bodywork. "Why have we stopped?" Selina's neat, smoke-silver head turned in surprise. "Look at that sign. Let's go up and see what there is. The stuff might be reasonably priced out here." Selina's voice was pitched high with scorn as she refused, but I was too taken with my idea to listen. I had an illogical conviction that doing something extravagant and crazy would set us right again. "Come on," I said. "The exercise might do us some good. We've been driving too long anyway." She shrugged in a way that hurt me and got out of the car. We walked up a path made of irregular, packed clay steps nosed with short lengths of sapling. The path curved through trees, which clothed the edge of the hill, and at its end we found a low farmhouse. Beyond the little stone building, tall frames of sloe glass gazed out towards the voice-stilling sight of Crucian's ponderous descent towards the waters of Loch Lynn. Most of the panes were perfectly transparent, but a few were dark, like panels of polished ebony. As we approached the house through a neat, cobbled yard, a tall, middle-aged man in ash-colored tweeds arose and waved to us. He had been sitting on the low rubble wall which bounded the yard, smoking a pipe and staring towards the house. At the front window of the cottage, a young woman in a tangerine dress stood with a small boy in her arms, but she turned disinterestedly and moved out of sight as we drew near. "Mr. Hagen?" I guessed. "Correct. Come to see some glass, have you? Well, you've come to the right place." Hagen spoke crisply, with traces of the pure Highland, which sounds so much like Irish to the unaccustomed ear. He had one of those calmly dismayed faces one finds on elderly road menders and philosophers. "Yes," I said. "We're on holiday. We saw your sign." Selina, who usually has a natural fluency with strangers, said nothing. She was looking towards the now empty window with what I thought was a slightly puzzled expression. "Up from London, are you?" "Well, as I said, you've come to the right place, and at the right time, too. My wife and I don't see many people this early in the season." I laughed. "Does that mean we might be able to buy a little glass without mortgaging our home?" "Look at that now," Hagen said, smiling helplessly. "I've thrown away any advantage I might have had in this transaction. Rose, that's my wife, says I never learn. Still, let's sit down and talk it over." He pointed at the rubble wall, then glanced doubtfully at Selina's immaculate blue skirt. "Wait till I fetch a rug from the house." Hagen limped quickly into the cottage, closing the door behind him. "Perhaps it wasn't such a marvelous idea to come up here," I whispered to Selina. "But you might at least be pleasant to the man. I think I can smell a bargain." "Some hope," she said with deliberate coarseness. "Surely even you must have noticed that ancient dress his wife is wearing. He won't give much away to strangers." "Was that his wife?" "Of course that was his wife." "Well, well," I said, surprised. "Anyway, try to be civil with him. I don't want to be embarrassed." Selina snorted, but she smiled whitely when Hagen reappeared, and I relaxed a little. Strange how a man can love a woman and yet at the same time pray for her to fall under a train. Hagen spread a tartan blanket on the wall, and we sat down, feeling slightly self-conscious at having been translated from our city-oriented lives into a rural tableau. On the distant slate of the loch, beyond the watchful frames of sloe glass, a slow-moving steamer drew a white line towards the south. The boisterous mountain air seemed almost to invade our lungs, giving us more oxygen than we required. "Some of the glass farmers around here," Hagen began, "give strangers such as yourselves a sales talk about how beautiful the autumn is in this part of Argyll. Or it might be the spring or the winter. I don't do that. Any fool knows that a place which doesn't look right in summer never looks right. What do you say?" I nodded compliantly. "I want you to just take a good look out towards Mole, Mr. Garland. Garland, that's what you're buying if you buy my glass, and it never looks better than it does at this minute. The glass is in perfect phase. None of it is less than 10 years thick, and a 4-foot window will cost you £200. 200? Selina was shocked. "That's as much as they charge at the Senadout shop in Bond Street." Hagen smiled patiently, then looked closely at me to see if I knew enough about slow glass to appreciate what he had been saying. His price had been much higher than I had hoped, but 10 years thick? The cheap glass one found in places like the Vistaplex and Panorama stores usually consisted of a quarter of an inch of ordinary glass faced with a veneer of slow glass, perhaps only 10 or 12 months thick. "You don't understand, darling," I said, already determined to buy. "This glass will last 10 years, and it's in phase. Doesn't that only mean it keeps time?" Hagen smiled at her again, realizing he had no further necessity to bother with me. "Only you say. Pardon me, Mrs. Garland, but you don't seem to appreciate the miracle, the genuine, honest-to-goodness miracle of engineering precision needed to produce a piece of glass in phase. When I say the glass is 10 years thick, I mean it takes light 10 years to pass through it. In effect, each one of those panes is 10 light-years thick, more than twice the distance to the nearest star. So a variation in actual thickness of only a millionth of an inch would—" He stopped talking for a moment and sat quietly, looking towards the house. I turned my head from the view of the lock and saw the young woman standing at the window again. Hagen's eyes were filled with a kind of greedy reverence, which made me feel uncomfortable and at the same time convinced me Selina had been wrong. In my experience, husbands never looked at wives that way, at least not at their own. The girl remained in view for a few seconds, dress glowing warmly, then moved back into the room. Suddenly, I received a distinct, though inexplicable, impression she was blind. My feeling was that Selina and I were perhaps blundering through an emotional interplay as violent as our own. "I'm sorry," Hagen continued. "I thought Rose was going to call me for something. Now, where was I, Mrs. Garland? 10 light-years compressed into a quarter of an inch means—" I ceased to listen, partly because I was already sold, partly because I had heard the story of slow glass many times before and had never yet understood the principles involved. An acquaintance with scientific training had once tried to be helpful by telling me to visualize a pane of slow glass as a hologram which did not need coherent light from a laser for the reconstitution of its visual information, and in which every photon of ordinary light passed through a spiral tunnel coiled outside the radius of capture of each atom in the glass. This gem of, to me, incomprehensibility not only told me nothing, it convinced me once again that a mind as non-technical as mine should concern itself less with causes than effects. The most important effect in the eyes of the average individual was that light took a long time to pass through a sheet of slow glass. A new piece was always jet black because nothing had yet come through, but one could stand the glass beside, say, a woodland lake until the scene emerged, perhaps a year later. If the glass was then removed and installed in a dismal city flat, the flat would, for that year, appear to overlook the woodland lake. During the year, it wouldn't be merely a very realistic, but still picture. The water would ripple in sunlight. Silent animals would come to drink. Birds would cross the sky. Night would follow day. Season would follow season. Until one day, a year later, the beauty held in the subatomic pipelines would be exhausted and the familiar gray cityscape would reappear. Apart from its stupendous novelty value, the commercial success of slow glass was founded on the fact that having a Sindao was the exact emotional equivalent of owning land. The meanest cave dweller could look out on misty parks, and who was to say they weren't his? A man who really owns tailored gardens and estates doesn't spend his time proving his ownership by crawling on his ground, feeling, smelling, tasting it. All he receives from the land are light patterns, and with Sindaos, those patterns could be taken into coal mines, submarines, prison cells. On several occasions, I have tried to write short pieces about the enchanted crystal, but to me the theme is so ineffably poetic as to be, paradoxically, beyond the reach of poetry. Mine, at any rate. Besides, the best songs and verse had already been written, with prescient inspiration, by men who had died long before sloe glass was discovered. I had no hope of equaling, for example, Moore with his. Oft in the stilly night, ere slumber's chain has bound me, fond memory brings the light of other days around me. It only took a few years for sloe glass to develop from a scientific curiosity to a sizable industry, and much to the astonishment of we poets, those of us who remain convinced that beauty lives through lilies die, the trappings of that industry were no different from those of any other. There were good Sindaos which cost a lot of money, and there were inferior Sindaos which cost rather less. The thickness, measured in years, was an important factor in the cost, but there was also the question of actual thickness, or phase. Even with the most sophisticated engineering techniques available, thickness control was something of a hit-and-miss affair. A coarse discrepancy could mean that a pane intended to be 5 years thick might be 5.5, so that light which entered in summer emerged in winter. A fine discrepancy could mean that noon sunshine emerged at midnight. These incompatibilities had their peculiar charm. Many night workers, for example, liked having their own private time zones, but in general it cost more to buy Sindaos which kept closely in step with real time. Selina still looked unconvinced when Hagen had finished speaking. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, and I knew he had been using the wrong approach. Quite suddenly, the pewter helmet of her hair was disturbed by a cool gust of wind, and huge, clean, tumbling drops of rain began to spang around us from an almost cloudless sky. "I'll give you a check now," I said abruptly, and saw Selina's green eyes triangulate angrily on my face. "You can arrange delivery?" "Aye, delivery's no problem," Hagen said, getting to his feet. "But wouldn't you rather take the glass with you?" "Well, yes, if you don't mind." I was ashamed by his readiness to trust my scrip. "I'll unclip a pane for you. Wait here. It won't take long to slip it into a carrying frame." Hagen limped down the slope towards the Siriat windows, through some of which the view towards Lynn was sunny, while others were cloudy and a few pure black. Selina drew the collar of her blouse closed at her throat. "The least he could have done was invite us inside. There can't be so many fools passing through that he can afford to neglect them." I tried to ignore the insult and concentrated on writing the check. One of the outside's drops broke across my knuckles, splattering the pink paper. "All right," I said. "Let's move in under the eaves till he gets back. You worm, I thought as I felt the whole thing go completely wrong. I just had to be a fool to marry you, a prize fool. A fool's fool. And now that you've trapped part of me inside you, I'll never, never, ever, never, ever get away." Feeling my stomach clench itself painfully, I ran behind Selina to the side of the cottage. Beyond the window, the neat living room, with its coal fire, was empty, but the child's toys were scattered on the floor. Alphabet blocks and a wheelbarrow, the exact color of freshly pared carrots. As I stared in, the boy came running from the other room and began kicking the blocks. He didn't notice me. A few moments later, the young woman entered the room and lifted him, laughing easily and wholeheartedly as she swung the boy under her arm. She came to the window as she had done earlier. I smiled self-consciously, but neither she nor the child responded. My forehead prickled icily. Could they both be blind? I sidled away. Selina gave a little scream, and I spun towards her. "The rug," she said. "It's getting soaked." She ran across the yard in the rain, snatched the reddish square from the dappling wall, and ran back towards the cottage door. Something heaved convulsively in my subconscious. "Selina!" I shouted. "Don't open it!" But I was too late. She had pushed open the latched wooden door and was standing hand over mouth, looking into the cottage. I moved close to her and took the rug from her unresisting fingers. As I was closing the door, I let my eyes traverse the cottage's interior. The neat living room in which I had just seen the woman and child was, in reality, a sickening clutter of shabby furniture, old newspapers, cast-off clothing, and smeared dishes. It was damp, stinking, and utterly deserted. The only object I recognized from my view through the window was the little wheelbarrow, paintless and broken. I latched the door firmly and ordered myself to forget what I had seen. Some men who live alone are good housekeepers. Others just don't know how. Selina's face was white. I don't understand it. Slow glass works both ways, I said gently. Light passes out of a house as well as in. You mean... I don't know. It isn't our business. Now steady up. Hagen's coming back with our glass. The churning in my stomach was beginning to subside. Hagen came into the yard carrying an oblong plastic-covered frame. I held the check out to him, but he was staring at Selina's face. He seemed to know immediately that our uncomprehending fingers had rummaged through his soul. Selina avoided his gaze. She was old and ill-looking, and her eyes stared determinedly towards the nearing horizon. "I'll take the rug from you, Mr. Garland," Hagen finally said. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself over it." No trouble. Here's the check." "Thank you." He was still looking at Selina with a strange kind of supplication. "It's been a pleasure to do business with you." "The pleasure was mine," I said with equal senseless formality. I picked up the heavy frame and guided Selina towards the path which led to the road. Just as we reached the head of the now slippery steps, Hagen spoke again. "Mr. Garland!" I turned unwillingly. "It wasn't my fault," he said steadily. "A hit-and-run driver got them both down on the Oban Road 6 years ago. My boy was only 7 when it happened. I'm entitled to keep something." I nodded wordlessly and moved down the path, holding my wife close to me, treasuring the feel of her arms locked around me. At the bend, I looked back through the rain and saw Hagen sitting with squared shoulders on the wall, where we had first seen him. He was looking at the house, but I was unable to tell if there was anyone at the window. Burden of proof. Harpur peered uncertainly through the streaming windows of his car. There had been no parking space close to the police headquarters, and now the building seemed separated from him by miles of puddled concrete and parading curtains of rain. The sky sagged darkly and heavily between the buildings around the square. Suddenly aware of his age, he stared for a long moment at the old police block and its cascading gutters before levering himself stiffly out of the driving seat. It was difficult to believe the sun was shining warmly in a basement room under the West Wing. Yet he knew it was, because he had phoned and asked about it before leaving home. "It's real nice down here today, Judge," the guard had said, speaking with the respectful familiarity he had developed over the years. "Not so good outside, of course, but down here it's real nice." "Have any reporters shown up yet?" Just a few so far, Judge. You coming over?" "I expect so," Harpur had replied. "Save a seat for me, Sam." "Yes, sir." Harpur moved as quickly as he dared, feeling the cool rain penetrate to the backs of his hands in his showerproof's pockets. The lining clung around the knuckles when he moved his fingers. As he climbed the steps to the front entrance, a preliminary flutter in the left side of his chest told him he had hurried too much, pushed things too far. The officer at the door saluted smartly. Harpur nodded to him. "Hard to believe this is June, isn't it, Ben?" "Sure is, sir. I hear it's nice down below, though." Harpur waved to the guard, and he was moving along the corridor when the pane closed with him. It was very clean, very pure, as though someone had carefully chosen a sterile needle, fitted it into an antiseptic handle, heated it to whiteness, and, with the swiftness of compassion, run it into his side. He stopped for a moment and leaned on the tiled wall, trying not to be conspicuous, while perspiration pricked out on his forehead. "I can't give up hope now," he thought. "Not when there's only another couple of weeks to go. But supposing this is it, right now." Harpur fought the panic until the entity that was his pain withdrew a short distance. He drew a shuddering breath of relief and began to walk again, slowly, aware that his enemy was watching and following. But he reached the sunshine without any further attacks. Sam McNamara, the guard at the inner door, started to give his usual grin, and then, seeing the strain on Harpur's face, ushered him quickly into the room. McNamara was a tall Irishman whose only ambition seemed to be to drink 2 cups of coffee every hour on the hour, but they had developed a friendship which Harpur found strangely comforting. He shook out a fold-up chair at the back of the room and held it steady while Harpur sat down. "Thank you, Sam," Harpur said gratefully, glancing around at the unfamiliar crowd, none of whom had noticed his arrival. They were all staring towards the sunlight. The smell of the rain-damp clothing worn by the reporters seemed strangely out of place in the dusty, underground room. It was part of the oldest wing of the police headquarters, and until 10 years before, had been used to store obsolete records. Since then, except on special press days, its bare concrete walls had housed nothing but a bank of monitoring equipment, 2 very bored guards, and a pane of glass mounted in a frame at one end of the room. The glass was of the very special variety through which light took many years to pass. It was the sort people used to capture scenes of exceptional beauty for their homes. To Harpur's eyes, the view through this piece of slow glass had no particular beauty. It showed a reasonably pretty bay on the Atlantic coast, but the water was cluttered with sports boats, and a garishly painted service station obtruded in the foreground. A connoisseur of slow glass would have thrown a rock through it, but Emil Bennett, the original owner, had brought it to the city simply because it contained the view from his childhood home. Having it available, he had explained, saved him a 200-mile drive any time he felt homesick. The sheet of glass Bennett had used was 10 years thick, which meant that it had had to stand for 10 years at his parents' home before the view from there came through. It continued, of course, to transmit the same view for 10 years after being brought back to the city, regardless of the fact that it had been confiscated from Bennett by impatient police officers who had a profound disinterest in his parental home. It would report, without fail, everything it ever saw, but only in its own good time. Slumped tiredly in his seat, Harpur was reminded of the last time he had been to a movie. The only light in the room was that coming from the oblong pane of glass, and the reporters sat fidgeting in orderly rows like a movie audience. Harpur found their presence distracting. It prevented him from slipping into the past as easily as usual. The shifting waters of the bay scattered sunlight through the otherwise dismal room. The little boats crossed and recrossed, and silent cars occasionally slid into the service station. An attractive girl in the extremely abbreviated dress of a decade ago walked across a garden in the foreground, and Harpur saw several of the reporters jot some personal angle material in their notebooks. One of the more inquisitive left his seat and walked around behind the pane of glass to see the view from the other side, but came back looking disappointed. Harpur knew a sheet of metal had been welded into the frame at the back, completely covering the glass. The county had ruled that it would have been an invasion of the senior Bennett's privacy to put on public view all their domestic activities during the time the glass was being charged. As the minutes began to drag out in the choking atmosphere of the room, the reporters grew noticeably restless and began loudly swapping yarns. Somewhere near the front, one of them began sneezing monotonously and swearing in between. No smoking was permitted near the monitoring equipment, which, on behalf of the state, hungrily scanned the glass, so relays of 3 and 4 began to drift out into the corridor to light cigarettes. Harpur heard them complaining about the long wait, and he smiled. He had been waiting for 10 years, and it seemed even longer. Today, June 7th, was one of the key days for which he and the rest of the country had been standing by, but it had been impossible to let the press know in advance the exact moment at which they would get their story. The trouble was that Emil Bennett had never been able to remember just what time, on that hot Sunday, he had driven to his parents' home to collect his sheet of slow glass. During the subsequent trial, it had not been possible to pin it down to anything more definite than about 3 in the afternoon. One of the reporters finally noticed Harpur sitting near the door and came over to him. He was sharply dressed, fair-haired, and impossibly young-looking. "Pardon me, sir, aren't you Judge Harpur?" Harpur nodded. The boy's eyes widened briefly, then narrowed as he assessed the older man's present news value. "Weren't you the presiding judge in the Rattle case?" He had been going to say the Glass Eye case, but immediately changed his mind. Harpur nodded again. "Yes, that's correct, but I no longer give interviews to the press. I'm sorry." "That's all right, sir. I understand." He went on out to the corridor, walking with quicker, springier steps. Harpur guessed the young man had just decided on his angle for today's story. He could have written the copy himself. "Today, Judge Kenneth Harpur, the man who had 10 years ago presided in the controversial Glass Eye case, in which 21-year-old Ewan Rattle was charged with a double slaying, sat on a chair in one of the underground rooms in police headquarters. An old man now, the Iron Judge has nothing at all to say. He only watches, waits, and wonders." Harpur smiled wryly. He no longer felt any bitterness over the newspaper attacks. The only reason he had stopped speaking to journalists was that he had become very, very bored with that aspect of his life. He had reached the age at which a man discards the unimportant stuff and concentrates on essentials. In another 2 weeks, he would be free to sit in the sun and note exactly how many shades of blue and green there were in the sea, and just how much time elapsed between the appearance of the first evening star and the second. If his physician allowed, he would have a little good whiskey, and if his physician refused it, he would still have the whiskey. He would read a few books and perhaps even write one. As it turned out, the estimated time given by Bennett at the trial had been pretty accurate. At 3 Harpur and the waiting newsman saw Bennett approach the glass from the far side with a screwdriver in his hand. He was wearing the sheepish look people often have when they get in range of slow glass. He worked at the sides for a moment. Then the sky flashed crazily into view, showing the glass had been tilted out of its frame. A moment later, the room went dark as the image of a brown army-type blanket unfolded across the glass, blotting out the laggard light. The monitors at the back of the room produced several faint clicking noises, which were drowned out by the sound of the reporters hurrying to telephones. Harpur got to his feet and slowly walked out behind the reporters. There was no need to hurry now. Police records showed that the glass would remain blanked out for 2 days because that was how long it had lain in the trunk of Bennett's car before he had got round to installing it in a window frame at the back of his city home. For a further 2 weeks after that, it would show the casual day-to-day events which took place 10 years before in the children's public playground at the rear of the Bennett house. Those events were of no particular interest to anyone, but the records also showed that in the same playground on the night of June 21st, 1981, a 20-year-old typist, Joan Calderisi, had been raped and murdered. Her boyfriend, a 23-year-old auto mechanic named Edward Jerome Hattie, had also been killed, presumably for trying to defend the girl. Unknown to the murderer, there had been one witness to the double killing, and now it was getting ready to give its perfect and incontrovertible evidence. The problem had not been difficult to foresee. Right from the day slow glass first appeared in a few very expensive stores, people had wondered what would happen if a crime were to be committed in its view. What would be the legal position if there were, say, 3 suspects, and it was known that 5 or 10 years later, a piece of glass would identify the murderer beyond all doubt? Obviously, the law could not risk punishing the wrong person, but equally obviously, the guilty one could not be allowed to go free all that time. This was how tabloid feature writers had summed it up, although to Judge Kenneth Harpur, there had been no problem at all. When he read the speculations, it took him less than 5 seconds to make up his mind, and he had been impressively unruffled when the test case came his way. That part had been a coincidence. Erskine County had no more homicides and no more slow glass than any other comparable area. In fact, Harpur had no recollection of ever seeing this stuff until Holt City's electrical street lighting system was suddenly replaced by alternating panels of 8-hour glass and 16-hour glass slung in continuous lines above the thoroughfares. That was several years after techniques had been developed for the mass production of slow glass, or, as it was officially known, retardite. It had taken some time for a retardite capable of producing delays, measured in years, to evolve from the first sheets which held light back by roughly half a second. The original material was developed by a glass manufacturer trying to produce a transparency which was both shatterproof and a really efficient insulator. Its unique properties might never have been noticed, but for the fact that it was first used, unfortunately for a number of people, in automobile windscreens. The auto manufacturer concerned spent upwards of $500,000 trying to find out why one batch of one model had been involved in a statistically improbable number of accidents involving right-hand turns. Expensive as the investigation was, it paid off because retardite became a major industry in a matter of months. Scene stealing was one of the prime applications, and slow glass farms sprang up at beauty spots all over the world. A large part of the commercial success of slow glass lay in the fact that there was absolutely no difference emotionally between owning a Sindao and owning the land which had charged it with light. The occupant of the most airless, glove-tight duplex in a city could look out on pine-clad valleys, and in every important respect they were his. It was also discovered that, for many applications, cameras had become obsolete. All planetary expeditions, manned or robotic, carried practically weightless retardite slivers of appropriate periods. In any cinematic field, from industrial recording to bird watching, where large footages had normally been wasted while waiting for an unpredictable key event, short-period slow glass was used instead. The cameras were turned on it, with comfortable hindsight, at the right moment. Spy cameras became tiny flecks of glass, which operatives had been known to push into their pores like blackheads. But no matter how varied the purpose, all slow glass applications had one thing in common. The user had to be absolutely certain of the time delay he wanted, because there was no way of speeding the process up. Had retardite been a glass in the true sense of the word, it might have been possible to place a piece down to a different thickness and get the information sooner, but in reality it was an extremely opaque material. Opaque in the sense that light never actually got into it. Radiations with wavelengths in the order that of light were absorbed on the face of a retardite panel and their information converted to stress patterns within the material. The piezoelectric effect by which the information worked its way through to the opposite face involved the whole crystalline structure, and anything which disturbed that structure instantaneously randomized the stress patterns. Infuriating as this discovery was to certain researchers, it had been an important factor in the commercial success of retardite. People would have been reluctant to install Sindaos in their homes, knowing that everything they had done behind them was being stored for other eyes to see years later. So the burgeoning piezoelectrics industry had been quick to invent an inexpensive tickler by which any piece of slow glass could be cleaned off for reuse like a cluttered computer program. This was also the reason why, for 10 years, 2 guards had been on a round-the-clock watch of the Sindao, which held the evidence in the Rattle case. There was always the chance that one of Rattle's relatives, or some publicity-seeking screwball, would sneak in and wipe the slate clean before its time came to resolve all doubts. There had been moments during the 10 years when Harpur had been too ill and tired to care very much, times when it would have been a relief to have the perfect witness silenced forever. But usually the existence of the slow glass did not bother him. He had made his ruling in the Rattle case, and it had been a decision he would have expected any other judge to make. The subsequent controversy, the enmity of sections of the press, the public, and even some of his colleagues had hurt at first, but he had got over that. The law, Harpur had said in his summing up, existed solely because people believed in it. Let that belief be shaken, even once, and the law would suffer irreparable harm. As near as could be determined, the killings had taken place about an hour before midnight. Keeping that in mind, Harpur ate dinner early, then showered and shaved for the second time that day. The effort represented a sizable proportion of his quota for the day, but it had been hot and sticky in the courtroom. His current case was involved and, at the same time, boring. More and more cases were like that lately, he realized. It was a sign he was ready to retire, but there was one more duty to perform. He owed that much to the profession. Harpur put on a lightweight jacket and stood with his back to the valet mirror which his wife had bought a few months earlier. It was faced with a sheet of 15-second retardite which allowed him, after a slight pause, to turn around and check his appearance from the back. He surveyed his frail but upright figure dispassionately, then walked away before the stranger in the glass could turn to look out. He disliked valet mirrors almost as much as the equally popular true viewers, which were merely pieces of short-term retardite pivotal on a vertical axis. They served roughly the same function as ordinary mirrors, except that there was no reversal effect. For the first time ever, the makers boasted, you could really see yourself as others saw you. Harpur objected to the idea on grounds he hoped were vaguely philosophical, but which he could not really explain, even to himself. "You don't look well, Kenneth," Ava said as he adjusted his tie minutely. "You haven't got to go down there, have you?" "No, I haven't got to go. That's why I've got to go. That's the whole point." "Then I'll drive you." "You won't. You're going to bed. I'm not going to let you drive around the city in the middle of the night." He put an arm round her shoulders. At 58, Ava Harpur was on a seemingly endless plateau of indomitable good health, but they maintained a fiction that it was he who looked after her. He drove himself into the city, but progress through the traffic was unusually slow, and on impulse he stopped several blocks from police headquarters and began to walk. Live dangerously, he thought, but walk slowly, just in case. It was a bright, warm evening, and with the long daylight hours of June, only the 16-hour panels slung above the thoroughfare were black. The alternating 8-hour panels were needlessly blazing with light they had absorbed in the afternoon. The system was a compromise with seasonal variations in daylight hours, but it worked reasonably well, and above all, the light was practically free. An additional advantage was that it provided the law enforcement authorities with perfect evidence about events like road accidents and traffic violations. In fact, it had been the then brand-new slow-glass lighting panels in 53rd Avenue which had provided a large part of the evidence in the case against Ewan Randall. Evidence on which Harpur had sent Randall to the electric chair. The salient facts of the case had not been exactly as in the classic situation proposed by the tabloids, but they had been near enough to arouse public interest. There had been no other known suspect apart from Randall, but the evidence against him had been largely circumstantial. The bodies had not been found until the next morning, by which time Randall had been able to get home, clean himself up, and have a night's sleep. When he was picked up, he was fresh, composed, and plausible, and the forensic teams had been able to prove almost nothing. The case against Randall was that he had been seen going towards the public playground at the right time, leaving it at the right time, and that he had bruises and scratches consistent with the crime. Also, between midnight and 9:30 in the morning, when he was taken in for questioning, he had lost the plastic-cord jacket he had worn on the previous evening, and it was never found. At the end of Randall's trial, the jury had taken less than an hour to arrive at a verdict of guilty, but during a subsequent appeal, his defense claimed the jury was influenced by the knowledge that the crime was recorded in Emil Bennett's rear window. The defense attorney, demanding a retrial, put forward the view that the jury had dismissed their reasonable doubt in the expectation that Harpur would, at the most, impose a life sentence. But in Harpur's eyes, the revised legal code drafted in 1977, mainly to give judges greater power in their own courts, made no provision for wait-and-see legislation, especially in cases of first-degree murder. In January 1982, Rattle was duly sentenced to be executed. Harpur's straightforward contention, which had earned him the name Iron Judge, was that a decision reached in a court of law always had been, and still was, sacrosanct. The superhuman entity which was the law must not be humbled before a fragment of glass. Reduced to its crudest terms, his argument was that if wait-and-see legislation were introduced, criminals would carry pieces of 50-year retardite with them as standard equipment. Within 2 years, the slow-grinding mills of the Supreme Court had ratified Harpur's decision, and the sentence was carried out. The same thing, on a microscopic scale, had occurred many times before in the world of sport, and the only possible, the only workable solution was that the umpire was always right, no matter what cameras or slow glass might say afterwards. In spite of his vindication, or perhaps because of it, the tabloids never warmed to Harpur. He began making a point of being indifferent to all that anybody wrote or said. All he had needed during the 10 years was the knowledge that he had made a good decision, as distinct from a wrong one. Now he was to discover if he had made a good decision as distinct from a bad one. Although this night had been looming on his horizon for a decade, Harpur found it difficult to realize that, in a matter of minutes, they would know if Rattle was guilty. The thought caused a crescendo of uncomfortable jolts in his chest, and he stopped for a moment to snatch air. After all, what difference did it really make? He had not made the law, so why feel personally involved? The answer came quickly. He was involved because he was part of the law. The reason he had gone on working against medical advice was that it was he, not some abstract embodiment of Webster's great interest of man on earth, who had passed sentence on you and Rattle. And he was going to be there, personally, to face the music if he had made a mistake. The realization was strangely comforting to Harpur as he moved on through the crowded streets. Something in the atmosphere of the late evening struck him as being odd. Then he noticed the city center was jammed tight with out-of-town automobiles. Men and women thronged the sidewalks, and he knew they were strangers by the way their eyes occasionally took in the upper parts of buildings. The smell of grilling hamburger meat drifted on the thick, downy air. Harpur wondered what the occasion might be. Then he noticed the general drift towards the police headquarters. So that was it. People had not changed since the days they were drawn towards arenas, guillotines, and gallows. There would be nothing for them to see, but to be close at hand would be sufficient to let them taste the ancient joy of continuing to breathe in the knowledge that someone else has just ceased. The fact that they were 10 years out of date, too, made no difference at all. Even Harpur, had he wanted to, could not have got into the underground room. Apart from the monitors, there would be only 6 chairs and 6 pairs of special binoculars with low magnifications and huge, light-hungry objective lenses. They were reserved for the state-appointed observers. Harpur had no interest in viewing the crime with his own eyes. He simply wanted to hear the result, then have a long, long rest. It occurred to him he was being completely irrational in going down to the police building. With all the exertion and lethal tension the trip meant for him, but somehow nothing else would do. "I'm guilty," he thought suddenly. Guilty as... He reached the plaza in which the building was situated and worked his way through the pliant, strength-draining barriers of people. By the time he was halfway across, sweat had bound his clothes so tightly he could hardly raise his feet. At an indeterminate point in the long journey, he became aware of another presence following close behind, the sorrowful friend with the white-hot needle. Reaching the untidy ranks of automobiles belonging to the press, Harpur realized he could not go in too early, and there was at least half an hour left. He turned and began forcing his way back to the opposite side of the plaza. The needlepoint caught up with him. One precise thrust, and he lurched forward, clawing for support. "What the—" A startled voice boomed over his head. "Take it easy, old-timer." Its owner was a burly giant in a pale blue one-piece who had been watching a 3D television broadcast when Harpur fell against him. He snatched off the receiver spectacles, the tiny left and right pictures glowing with movement like distant bonfires. A wisp of music escaped from the earpiece. "I'm sorry," Harpur said. "I tripped. I'm sorry." "That's all right. Say, aren't you Judge—" Harpur pushed on by as the big man tugged excitedly on the arm of a woman who was with him. "I mustn't be recognized," he thought in a panic. He burrowed into the crowd, now beginning to lose his sense of direction. 6 more desperate paces and the needle caught him again, right up to its antiseptic hilt this time. He moaned as the plaza tilted ponderously away. "Not here," he pleaded. "Not here. Please." Somehow he saved himself from falling and moved on. Near at hand, but a million miles away, an unseen woman gave a beautiful, carefree laugh. At the edge of the square, the pain returned, even more decisively than before. Once, twice, 3 times. Harpur screamed as he felt the life muscle implode in cramp. He began to go down, then felt himself gripped by firm hands. Harpur looked up at the swarthy young man who was holding him. The handsome, worry-creased face looming through reddish mists looked strangely familiar. Harpur struggled to speak. You're Ewan Rattle, aren't you?" The black eyebrows met in puzzlement. "Rattle? No, never heard of him. I think we'd better call an ambulance for you." Harpur thought hard. "That's right, you couldn't be Rattle. I killed him 10 years ago." Then he spoke louder. "But if you never heard of Rattle, why are you here?" "I was on my way home from a bowling match when I saw the crowd." The boy began getting Harpur out of the crowd, holding him up with one arm, fending uncomprehending bodies away with the other. Harpur tried to help, but was aware of his feet trailing helplessly on the concrete. "Do you live right here in Holt?" The boy nodded emphatically. "Do you know who I am?" "All I know about you, sir, is you should be in the hospital. I'll call an ambulance on the liquor store phone." Harpur felt vaguely that there was some tremendous significance in what they had been saying, but had no time to pursue the matter. "Listen," he said, forcing himself to stand upright for a moment. "I don't want an ambulance. I'll be fine if I can just get home. Can you help me get a cab?" The boy looked uncertain, then he shrugged. "It's your funeral." Harpur opened his door carefully and entered the friendly darkness of the big old house. During the ride out of town, his sweat-soaked clothes had become clammy cold, and he shivered uncontrollably as he felt for the light switch. With the light on, he sat down beside the telephone and looked at his watch. Almost midnight. By this time there would be no mystery, no doubt about exactly what had happened in the 53rd Avenue playground 10 years earlier. He picked up the handset and at the same moment heard his wife begin to move around upstairs. There were several numbers he could ring to ask what the slow glass had revealed, but the thought of talking to any police executive or someone in City Hall was too much. He called Sam McNamara. As a guard, Sam would not know the result officially, but he would have the answer just the same. Harpur tried to punch out the number of the direct line to the guard kiosk, but his finger joints kept buckling on impact with the buttons, and he gave up. Ava Harpur came down the stairs in her dressing gown and approached him apprehensively. "Oh, Kenneth," her hand went to her mouth. "What have you done? You look... I'll have to call Dr. Sherman." Harpur smiled weakly. "I do a lot of smiling these days," he thought irrelevantly. "It's the only response an old man can make to so many situations. All I want you to do is make me some coffee and help me up to my bed. But first of all, get me a number on this contraption." Ava opened her mouth to protest, then closed it as their eyes met. When Sam came to the phone, Harpur worked to keep his own voice level. "Hello, Sam. Judge Harpur here. Is the fun all over yet?" "Yes, sir. There was a press conference afterwards, and that's over, too. I guess you heard the result on the radio." "As a matter of fact, I haven't, Sam. I was out until a little while ago. Decided to ring someone about it before I went to bed, and your number just came into my head." Sam laughed uncertainly. "Well, they were able to make a positive identification. It was Rattle, all right. But I guess you knew that all along." "I guess I did, Sam." Harpur felt his eyes grow hot with tears. "It'll be a load off your mind all the same, Judge." Harpur nodded tiredly, but into the phone he said, "Well, naturally I'm glad there was no miscarriage of justice, but judges don't make the laws, Sam. They don't even decide who's guilty and who isn't. As far as I'm concerned, the presence of a peculiar piece of glass makes very little difference, one way or the other." It was a good speech for the Iron Judge. There was a long silence on the line. Then, with a note of something like desperation in his voice, Sam persisted. "I know all that, Judge, but all the same, it must have been a big load off your mind." Harpur realized, with a warm surprise, that the big Irishman was pleading with him. "It doesn't matter anymore," he thought. "In the morning, I'm going to retire and rejoin the human race." "All right, Sam," he said finally. "Let's put it this way. I'll sleep well tonight, all right?" "Thank you, Judge. Good night." Harpur set the phone down and, with his eyes tight closed, waited for peace. A dome of many-colored glass. The duel between the planner and the private was entering its 6th year. It was a quiet, bitter struggle, characterized and made remarkable by the fact that it had lasted more than the same number of weeks. By all the unwritten rules that govern such things, the planner should have been victorious at an early stage because all the resources, all the advantages were on his side. The planner's name was Lapwing Chun, and although he was answerable in the long run to Chairman Lin, his reputation in his own province was such that he had the authority of an emperor. A brilliant civil engineer, the profession had earned him his popular name. He had graduated to politics and earned a reputation as a theoretician, and had at one stage of his long life seemed destined to join the chief executive of the People's Republic. His progress in that direction had been checked by the related failings of personal egotism and provincialism. But these very faults strengthened his position with the people of the estuary in which he had been born. The system of flood control installations he had designed and insisted on building, despite certain prior claims the national plan had made on the area's productivity, had saved an estimated 500,000 lives within 5 years of its completion. He was tough, stubborn, clever, chauvinistic, and loved by the people. Within the boundaries of his own province, Lapwing Chun had what amounted to absolute power. He could, for instance, have had the private executed at any moment during the 6 long years of their duel, but that was not his way and not what he had set out to do. The private was not a private at all, and it was in the nature of their struggle that only he and Lapwing Chun knew or understood why he was so called. His name was Lawrence Bell Evans. He had been born in Portsmouth, England, but had grown up in Massachusetts and had been a lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force when his aircraft was struck by lightning during a flight from Manila to Seoul. It was forced down in the planner's domain, and Evans, the navigator, had been the only crew member to survive the crash. 2 decades earlier, he would have been transported to Peking for diplomatic auction to his own country. But there had been considerable development and change within the Kuomintang. The airman had no political value, and so his fate rested solely with Lapwing Chun. They, the planner and the private, had met briefly one afternoon when the former was on a routine visit to the 12th century fortress, which was supposed to be an historical monument, but which served as a convenient place in which to keep a variety of political freaks and misfits. And the intermittent 6-year duel had begun. At first, the planner's degree of involvement had not been great. The affair had been little more than a stray notion, a whim. He had despised Evans immediately and instinctively for his gangling, underdeveloped body, the baby pinkness of his face, and, most of all, for the softness he saw in the airman's nervous gray eyes. That softness, the obvious lack of political or social will, had been an affront to the planner's whole existence, and something had prompted him to mold the clay which had been placed in his hands. He had begun by presenting Evans with the classical proposition. It was self-evident that the American had been engaged in activities hostile to the Republic. Furthermore, the U.S. Air Force had written him off as dead with the rest of the crew of the lost aircraft. Therefore, there was no political machinery working on Evans' behalf. He was alone and could be buried without a trace. The Republic was entitled to have Evans executed without further delay, but the humanitarian ideals which inspired the leaders of the revolution prompted them to be merciful. If Evans would confess to his crime and acknowledge the greater crimes of his masters, he would be returned to his own country immediately. As was to be expected, Evans had refused. Lapwing Chun had smiled patiently, indulgently, and increased the pressure. It was during the 6th month that he began to realize he had misjudged his man. Evans was politically naive. He was physically weak. He had a great fear of pain and death. Yet he had an inner core of certitude, a philosophical armature which was unbreakable. "I want to sign the confession. I want to go home," he used to say. "But we both know it's untrue, therefore I can't sign." And on one occasion, "If you yourself believed what it says in this paper, I might be able to sign it and trick you, because then it wouldn't be very important. But you know the truth, and I know the truth, so what you're asking me to do is sit down with you and willingly cancel out my entire previous life. This can't be done." At this stage, Lapwing Chun still thought of his prisoner as Evans, or the American. Then Evans was found in his cell one morning, suffering from lobar pneumonia. During the subsequent fevers, Lap watched over him anxiously, fearing the intervention of death, and during one bedside vigil heard the young man whisper in delirium, "Last night," the words were barely audible in the long hospital room, "last night, among his fellow roughs he jested, quaffed, and swore." The planner, meticulous in everything he did, wrote the words down in his notebook and later, when he was satisfied Evans would recover, had a search made for their source. It was with some curiosity that he picked up the photo print brought by his secretary and read a poem called "The Private of the Buffs," with greater wonderment that he set the sheet aside. The verse, he could not class it as poetry, told a story which had some obvious parallels with Evans' situation. A lone Englishman in the hands of the Chinese, commanded to perform the kowtow, refuses to yield, accepts death before dishonor. The idea that any adult human might be influenced by and even cherish the imperialist principles embodied in the piece both amused and startled the planner. It also affected his approach to Evans because he now understood the politically primeval level on which his life and that of his prisoner interacted. This was a clash, not of ideology, but of the archetypal idea. He allowed several months to pass, then visited Evans in his cell. Evans was not surprised to see Lapwing Chun because it was during a period in which he was being allowed fairly frequent contact with other human beings. The planner allowed the conversation to wander aimlessly for a while before he touched on the subject of the poem. "I think you once told me," he began, "that you are fond of poetry." "Did I? I don't remember." "I may be able to arrange for you to have some anthologies." "Really?" Evans sounded uninterested. "Who are your favorite poets?" "The good ones." The planner nodded and examined the wood-grained skin of his hands. "The good ones? What do you think of the distinguished English doggerel writer, Sir Francis H. Doyle?" Evans frowned slightly. "As you say, he wrote distinguished English doggerel." The planner laughed compliantly. "The Private of the Buffs, the ultimate in jingoism, don't you think? It out-Kipples Kipling. By the way, the word jingoism has been obsolescent for rather a long time. Let dusky Indians whine and kneel, an English lad must die. Isn't it incredible?" "Fantastic." Evans' reaction had not been what the planner expected, and so he changed his approach. "Is that how you see yourself, Larry? The Private of the Buffs?" "You've got to be joking." "But the parallels are so obvious," the planner insisted. "The situation is virtually identical." "No. There's one very big difference, and that is, in the poem, at the private's first refusal to perform the kowtow, the Chinese warlord had him killed. You see, the warlord was sure of himself. It wasn't all that important to him whether the Private of the Buffs yielded or not." Evans smiled, revealing teeth which were beginning to show signs of dictory deficiencies. "But you wouldn't kill me, would you?" For perhaps the 100th time, the planner opened the tiny leather-covered box and examined its contents. 2 small glassy discs glowed at him from their nests of velvet. They were slightly domed, shining with every color of life, like cabicons of some exquisite, precious stone. "These arrived just in time," he thought, closing the box again. "After 6 years, the private's health has almost been destroyed." He took a deep breath and entered the discreetly positioned hospital room to which the prisoner had been transferred. Dr. Singh and two white-coated orderlies were standing by the bed. Evans was lying perfectly still, staring at the high ceiling, his wasted body covered to the chin. "Is that you, Lap?" he said weakly. "Got something good for me this time?" "Something very special this time, Larry." The planner opened his little box again and held it close to Evans' face. Evans narrowed his eyes. "Jewels?" "Retardite. Slow glass. You're familiar with the material?" "Oh, that stuff." Evans lowered his head back onto the pillow. "They were making jewelry out of it when I was..." His voice faded away uncertainly. "It has much more important uses now, Larry. Techniques have been developed for controlling the emission of stored light. It is possible to see everything a piece of slow glass has seen, exactly when you want to see it." The planner made sure his voice revealed none of the excitement and hunger and fear which pounded within him. "What has that to do with me?" "Look at the box again, Larry. Look at the shapes. What do they remind you of?" Evans raised his head with obvious effort. "Two little domes of glass. They're like contact lenses. For me?" The planner nodded. "Very good, Larry. You're going on a trip." "Where to?" Evans' voice was guarded now. "Have you heard of a Vietnamese village called My Lai?" "I'm not sure." "Your memory will be refreshed. Your journey will take you to My Lai and 100 other similar places. In some cases, what you see will obviously be filmed material, but as you get more up to date, you will be looking through slow glass, which was at the actual scenes. You'll be there, Larry. As far as the evidence of your eyes is concerned, you will really be present at all these places. Even when you're asleep, you'll still be there, watching and watching and... What sort of places are you talking about?" "You'll see. You're going on a conducted tour of those areas of the world which your country has liberated with the aid of napalm and cluster bombs. You're going to see yourself as others have seen you." You can't make me look at anything I don't want to see." "No?" The planner nodded, and the two watchful orderlies threw straps across the bed, buckling them down tightly over Evans' chest, hips, and legs. Evans responded by rolling his eyes frantically to prevent them being worked upon. Dr. Singh picked up a gleaming hypodermic gun from his instrument tray and fired a tiny cloud of highly specialized anesthetic into Evans' temple. The rapid eye movements ceased almost at once, and Evans' jaw sagged. Using an object like a small chromium-plated shoehorn, Dr. Singh expertly turned the prisoner's eyes in their sockets until they were staring directly ahead. The planner handed him the leather-covered box. "You sure he's conscious?" "He is fully conscious," Singh replied. "We have merely deprived him of the control of certain delicate muscles." Squeezing a drop of clear fluid onto each of Evans' eyes, he picked up the slow glass discs with a suction tube and placed them on the immobilized eyeballs. He made certain the discs were properly oriented by checking that the red dot on the edge of each was in the 12 o'clock position and stepped back from the bed. Evans now had brilliantly glowing multicolored discs in place of eyes. Singh picked up an object like a black flashlight, moved its slide, and pointed it briefly at the prisoner's face. The jewels came to life, swirling with microscopic movement. The planner waited until his prisoner had been touring Atrocityville for a full 12 hours. Then he returned to the bedside. He gazed down at the bearded El Greco face for a long moment with a mixture of pity and contempt. Evan's mouth was open, his lips drawn back from the blackened ruins of his teeth, and a fine thread of saliva glinted on his cheek. The planter sat down and put his mouth close to Evan's ear. "Larry," he said gently, "I'm still your friend, and I'm sorry we had to force the truth on you in this way. I want to bring you back from wherever you are right now. All you have to do is sign the confession. What's your answer, Larry?" He peered into Evan's face and into the eyes which were orange ports of hell. The planter's own eyes widened with shock. He stood up and backed away from the bed, his fingers fluttering nervously to his mouth. "There's something wrong," he mumbled. "The private is smiling." Dr. Singh spoke emotionlessly behind him. "I warned you this might happen, comrade. Your prisoner has escaped from you." In the end, Evans was able to make the transition to psychosis smoothly. There had been a long journey filled with pain and horror, but all that was behind him now. He was back in England. Queen Victoria was secure on her throne, and soon he would be home. There was only a short distance to walk. Far Kentish hop fields round him seemed like dreams to come and go. Bright leagues of cherry blossom gleamed, one sheet of living snow. The smoke above his father's door in gray, soft eddyings hung. Brushing the dust from his torn khaki uniform, Private Evans slung his rifle over his shoulder and strode gratefully into the sunlight of a bygone century.